good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Connect, online conversations with experts from the Global Network for Advanced Management. The Global Network for Advanced Management is an alliance of 31 of the world's leading business schools from all 6 continents. We connect students, faculty, and staff. And what it unites us is a belief that all of us benefit from the insights and perspectives of our peers, and we must work together to optimally prepare our students for global leadership roles. And nowhere could this more true and more apparent than in the face of this global pandemic. We have a terrific panel of 4 experts who agreed to join us for this conversation several weeks ago. And of course, this situation is moving so fast, so quickly, that I'm fortunate that a number of additional colleagues have agreed to join us since. Let me introduce them. We have Giacomo Francisco from the Asian Institute of Management. He's a professor and associate dean there. Ignacio de la Vega, who is dean and professor at the Agata Business School in Mexico. We have Howard Foreman, professor of radiology, public health, and management here at Yale. Zhiyong Yao, professor of economics from Fudan University in Shanghai. And we have Jerome Ada, who is at the Bocconi University in Italy, where he is a professor of economics. Also joining us already is Jörg Ochel, who is president of ESMT, European School of Management and Technology in Berlin, in Germany, where he's a professor of finance and economics. And we have a couple of other colleagues joining us probably over the course of the hour. I'm delighted to have such a terrific panel, so many diverse perspectives. One thing I do want to acknowledge from the beginning, we're not doing great on gender diversity today, and that's not for a lack of effort. There are a number of women colleagues who we invited. Unfortunately, scheduling conflicts made it impossible for them to join. So we have an all-male panel. It's not ideal, but I think the perspectives you will enjoy. Just joining us now is Professor Andrew Metrick, who is professor of finance at Yale School of Management, and he leads the program on financial stability at the school. And we'll get to him in a couple of minutes to get his take on the global financial system in this crisis. I wanted to start out by asking Howie, Professor Howie Foreman, to offer a sort of global overview from a public health point of view. Howie, can you give us a sense, where are we in this pandemic? How does the picture vary across some key countries? You've been paying close attention to dynamics in a number of different places.
Right. So I think, I think some parts of the world are actually past the peak and now dealing with mitigation and to some degree even containment. And it's, heartening to see South Korea and China beginning to emerge, particularly the regions that have been hardest hit from this pandemic. And then there are parts of the world that are, currently out of control, but having put in place various suppression measures over the last couple of weeks that we should expect to see substantial mitigation starting to occur about now, particularly in places like Italy and then subsequently Spain. And in the United States, we're probably still 5 or 6 days away from what would be the peak growth rate in this pandemic, not even getting to anywhere close to the peak of this outbreak. So we're learning from each other, and I think to some degree the United States stood apart from the world and did not learn from some of the experiences of our peer nations. But I think now we are starting to reckon with what we're facing, and we recognize that there is a lot of hard work ahead.
So you mentioned the dire situation in many places, and of course Italy is very much on everybody's mind. The news coming from there have been particularly disheartening. And Jerome, what's your perspective as this is unfolding, as this human tragedy is unfolding, particularly in the north of Italy? Does it make sense to think about economic impact at this point, or where you said really economics and economic policy and economic impact are entirely secondary as policymakers and leaders are trying to deal just with this public health emergency?
Well, So the situation in Italy is evolving fast, I think. So it's shocking because of the number of deaths, but one particular point is that Italy is probably a week in advance for, compared to France and Germany and the UK, and probably 2 weeks ahead of the US. Having said that, we had 2 days in a row a decrease in the number of cases, a decrease in the number of deaths compared from day to day. So I think, this epidemic is starting to get into control. So part of Italy has been in lockdown for about a month, and the whole of Italy has been in lockdown for about 2 weeks now. And I think we're starting to see how things are actually slowing down a bit. It was particularly a hard hit because the virus diffused mostly in the elderly community. There's very strong ties between elderly and young people in Italy, and that made this community very vulnerable. But the dynamic seems to be, at least in the last few days, a bit more, looking a bit more optimistic. So I think it's never too late to think about economics. We didn't think enough about epidemics and epidemiology in the last 2 or 3 months. And I don't think we should, stop thinking about economics and the aftermath, because that will come, maybe not very, very quick, but it will come in a couple of months or so, and we better be prepared for that.
And Jerome, can you get us a sense of just what you're seeing initially? I mean, I presume there's no economic activity to speak of other than just essential services in much of the country at this point, with lockdown going into its 3rd week.
That's correct. So there was some before, and then the government locked it down a few days ago. So only essential supplies and trains are running, transportation is running, but they're mostly empty.
So you said that much of the world is sort of a few days or a few weeks perhaps behind Italy, and many countries are learning important lessons, thankfully. But of course, Italy came on the heels of the initial outbreak in China. So Zhiyong, I'd like to turn to you and perhaps ask you to give us a sense of what the situation is right now in Shanghai and more broadly in China. An almost 2 months lockdown is coming to an end. What's the mood and what's the economic impact as far as you can see? I think you're muted, just.
Okay, good, thank you. Yes, so China and Shanghai actually gradually climbing back. But as you can imagine, so our first quarter, the economic growth will be negative for sure. You can imagine that, right? And for the negative economic growth, we haven't seen for like decades, not in my memory, but yeah, the first quarter will be, economic growth will be negative for sure. And I really don't want to scare you guys with our ugly statistic data, but in the first 2 months, you can imagine our retailing dropped like more than 20%. The investment dropped like more than 24%, and so on and so forth. But however, things are kind of like getting better. So, but given the outbreak outside of China, so the second quarter, the economy will going back. Probably will have like a positive economic growth, but not very much. So we are really in the interdependent, like US, China, Europe, both economically and socially. So I think China should and will hope out, given we kind of coming back. And so many countries help China in the first place. And kind of by helping others, China actually help ourselves. And if US and Europe can contain the virus, I think the economy will bounce back in the third quarter. And then China will be okay at that time and go back to normal. Yeah, in the third quarter, I hope. Yes.
So that's a hopeful perspective. You know, very big hit in the first quarter, but signs of economic revitalization, perhaps. One of the things I failed to mention at the beginning of this broadcast is that we'll sprinkle in a couple of polls. We have a large, globally diverse audience, and we'd like to get your views. And Ben, I don't know if you can share on the screen the result of the first poll, but if not, I'll just read it out briefly. There you have it. We asked at this point whether people are personally concerned about their health. 48% say they're very concerned, 41% are somewhat concerned. So 90% of people somewhat are very concerned about their health. Obviously, many other aspects of life, including economic activity, come secondary, and that's even before you get to the economic policies, the public health policies that we've seen that have dampened economic activity. Jiong, you spoke about interdependence, and of course that interdependence doesn't just exist between the US and China and the US and Europe, but also in the region. And Jamu, the economy of the Philippines, of course, is affected by what is happening in major markets around the world, particularly in China. Can you speak about where you sit in the Philippines, how you're dealing on the one hand side with growing prevalence of COVID-19 cases and economic disruption at the same time? What are your concerns where you sit?
Yeah, just today, actually, I think we reported the highest increase in COVID cases. I think it's brought the number up to about 550. But just following up on the poll, which you flashed, I think, and so many of our participants are very concerned with their health. I think that's one of the challenges of the situation for the Philippines included, because it's always started as a public health concern. And of course, the sweeping measures that governments have done. Our government, for example, has imposed what they call an enhanced community quarantine over the whole of Luzon, which practically all of our economic activity happens. The economic repercussions were almost like an afterthought. And this is very problematic because I know Zhuang had spoken about the macroeconomic effects of this at China and global supply chains. But I'd actually want to redirect the attention to, you know, your average people, your workers, for example. David, I see your background. That's New York City, and I've been reading some articles in the New York Times talking about how, you know, your restaurants, your bars, your gyms are closed, and that's affecting so many daily wage earners. I mean, imagine how that impacts people in a developing country like ours, where you practically have a fourth of the population technically below the poverty line. These are people with no savings at all, and you know, we have a prolonged lockdown of a month. Not 2 weeks, like it was in Italy or in the US. It's a full month. And imagine if you're a daily wage earner, you don't have income. What does that mean? And second, actually, what people are beginning to worry about now are small business. I'm sure later on we'll talk about recovery, but you know, I mean, if we do make it, you know, hopefully we make it alive after a month. The problem is, will people actually have work to return to after a month? And you have your small businesses here. 63% of employment in the Philippines is from small business. So it's scary. This economic fallout can just quickly turn into like a social humanitarian crisis of sorts if we don't act quickly. I'm sorry if I sound so negative, but it's particularly poignant in a developing country setting, I think.
I so appreciate you being so clear about this. You know, economic crises are always social and humanitarian crises, and they feed on one another. Can you say perhaps a word about what government policy has been on the economic front in particular? Is there support for small businesses?
Just today, actually, this afternoon or this morning, our Congress had passed a bill for basically giving, they're calling it emergency powers to the executive branch to realign the budget. I think they're talking somewhere close to $5 billion, if I'm not mistaken. That's $5 billion. That's 300 billion pesos worth of realignment. That's a pretty small amount. It's about 17%, I think, of our budget. But that really is going mostly to, number one, just getting us to where we should be, meaning we weren't ready for this crisis. I don't think anyone was. But our government, our health sector, our hospitals weren't ready for it. We don't have the necessary equipment, the ventilators, the protective equipment. So a lot of that money will actually go even just to getting us ready for the deluge of patients that might be expected. A large chunk of that will also go to, I think they identified 18 million low-income households that they plan to give out around $100 to $150 worth of allowance for as much as 2 months. But that's it. For small business, there is some allotment, but then unfortunately, small businesses tend to be not on top of the priority list, especially if the resources available are not that many.
So you said the Philippines weren't ready and most countries weren't ready, but some countries, as Howie, as you pointed out at the start, this is sort of happening sequentially, and you get outbreaks in different parts of the world. And Mexico, it seems like, at least from official data so far, has seen a fairly or comparatively small number of cases. Ignacio, where you sit, is Mexico taking the proper steps to prepare and benefiting from the unfortunate experience of some other countries that were caught off guard?
Good morning, everyone. I'd love to say that, but honestly, I don't think so. I mean, one of the reasons we see, a much smaller amount of case is probably the lack of testing. It's showing capabilities for testing a large portion of the population. And so if you don't test, you don't get big numbers. This is one of the reasons, in my opinion. Second one is, as we know, this virus is behaving east to west in a very consistent manner. So we might be a couple of weeks or 2.5 weeks still from the peak of, as things have shown in Italy, in Spain, before in Iran or in China. I mean, the reality is that population here has been aware of the consequences and the importance of this outbreak. Most of the protection comes from population itself. So large parts of the country have been secluded and went into a voluntary closing probably like 2 weeks ago already. And this might, of course, impact the severity of the spread of the virus. Starting to talk about consequences, and I think we are still trying to find out how to fight and how to be ready for when this thing really breaks into the country and into the region. Of course, consequences from an economic perspective seem ugly. Some Latin American countries, definitely Mexico is one of them, is not that prepared from a macro perspective to fight a long and probably deep crisis. We start talking about the global product going down 5% on average. This is large banks and research houses are pointing out. And of course, as our Filipino colleague pointed out, this is a country quite a balance. So the consequences of those that really live on a daily wage are going to be very severe. Let me finish this first part of my words, talking about some hope. I see there are some good things coming out of here. Of course, previous crises shown that we will recover. The question is when, and this will depend on how deep this the spread goes into Latin America. But definitely we will recover. This might be a V, a U, an L, any form, but probably by the end of the year, we will start looking at recovery. But the opportunities beyond that, for Mexico, the opportunities to get much stronger in these global supply chain opportunities. I think China is going to be displaced for many manufacturers all over the world are going to try to find spots closer to their logistic chains and probably safer in terms of diversification. So there is a good opportunity for some Latin American economies to position there. And there is a second one I would like to point out. And we've been talking for a few years now on how capitalism needs to change and how the business would need to have a different role in society. And we're talking from moving from a stakeholder to a shareholder capitalism. And I believe this is a great opportunity, and companies are already shown, many companies all over the world, their strength will to really move into and just the role of business into society to something much more inclusive and generous. It will end up this crisis in a few months. It will be a different society, and businesses will definitely need to behave different from what we have seen in the past.
Thank you for that. And you're focusing our attention already that a recovery doesn't necessarily bring us back to where we were. And in fact, with a calamity of this scale, it's quite possible that the world will change in important ways. And you pointed at two of those changes, right? Changes in supply chains and changes in the way business relates to broader society. I want to come back to them. Andrew, turning to you, and I know your time is limited, but it seems our hope for a quick recovery, even though we're still very much in the middle of this, hinge in part, at least, on overall systemic stability. And you were in Washington, D.C. in 2009, 2010, helping to stabilize the global financial system after the subprime mortgage crisis, and have since then worked. Perhaps you didn't think of a scenario like this, but for a situation like this, where we have at the same time all over the world economic shocks that might be causing the financial system as a whole to become unbalanced. How worried are you about financial stability, and what indicators are you looking at? Give us a sense on the financial stability side.
Sure, David. Can you hear me? Am I muted or?
No, you're good.
Great, thank you. I've already learned something listening to my colleagues here today, so thank you very much to the other panelists. I would say I'm very concerned about financial stability. What we're seeing now in financial markets is most a liquidity problem. So it's not yet a solvency, and you really need to have a lot of fear about solvency for it to be termed a full financial crisis. That's when it would be a financial crisis, but we may yet move there. It's a liquidity problem, right? Because there's an enormous amount of disruption in all of the main financial markets. There's a lot of demand for just plain old cash for bank reserves, and so you're seeing really very large disruptions, not quite 2008 level disruptions. Well, I should say not late 2000, not September 2008 yet, but March 2008 kind of level disruptions, which are mostly about a scramble for liquidity in these markets. Whether or not we have a solvency crisis and the financial system really breaks down, which would be disastrous for having any recovery, depends on how long this lasts. So right now, the banks around the world are fairly well capitalized. So that means for banks, they have between 10 and 15% equity out of their total asset base. That can get eaten away in a significant downturn. And so a lot depends on how long this lasts, how long the economic disruption lasts globally. If it lasts long enough that we eat away that capital base of the banks, then we will start to see real solvency concerns and people afraid to leave their money anywhere but in their mattress. When that happens, that will be an accelerant. So right now our economic crisis is because we told everybody to stay home and not work, and we told people not to go out and consume, which are very sensible things to do. It will get a lot worse if the underlying machinery that helps the economy function breaks down. So you asked about what indicators I'm looking at. One thing I would recommend everybody look at if they want to have a sense for how bad things may be getting at any point in time is to look at the London interbank offering rate, the LIBOR, and you can just get that on a Wall Street Journal bonds and rates page. We'll have that for you. And what you can see there is really something very striking. The regular old government borrowing rates for wealthy countries right now are 0. and there's zero in the short term, say everything up to 3 months. But LIBOR, which is what it costs banks to borrow, that's a small number overnight, about 20 basis points, but about 1.2 basis points for 3 months. So the yield curve for banks borrowing in an unsecured way actually looks like that over a 3-month period. Again, that's early 2008 kind of look to it. If that steepens a whole lot more, then basically it's possible to get your money except overnight if you are a bank. And that's like the forest getting very, very, very dry. Once banks can only really borrow overnight because it's so much more expensive for them to do it over 3 months or 1 month, then it only takes a small shock for the whole thing to implode. So I've been looking at that, and I would, if you see that's widened and by an enormous amount. Usually that slope, by the way, is flat, even for banks, it's 0. If that goes up to having a slope from 0 to 2% or 0 to 3%, as we saw in September of 2008, then I think we're looking at something that is more than just a liquidity concern, but also a solvency concern. So that's my concern. And I think after this panel, I'll be reaching out to my friend Howie Foreman to get a better understanding of how some of these some of our pandemic responses are likely to evolve over the next year. It does seem that until there's a vaccine, we're really not going to get completely back to normal, and we're going to have some significant economic disruptions. And so, Howie, I'm going to need you to educate me a little bit on this.
Do you want to jump in on this, Howie? I mean, I know that the pundits are doing all of this sort of best case, worst case, but what do we know about possible length?
So, I mean, I think we've gotten a lot of instruction from China and South Korea, and we know, what you can do if you're very aggressive, and particularly early on, very aggressive. Right now, for the United States in particular, for Italy, for other places, but just looking domestically for the United States, we are still about a week away from seeing any impact from some of the tightening measures in terms of social distancing. We would expect that about a week from now, we would start to see some improvement in things. But until you actually can not just grow the cases slower, but actually stop growing cases, actually get cases to start going down, you can't possibly think about anything about loosening or releasing any of the levers. What we all can hope for the world over is therapeutic interventions and better testing. So South Korea, Bahrain, Germany, I would say there are some countries that are much more aggressively testing from the beginning, and that is going to help them. I have just no doubt about that. And what we're seeing right now in sort of the entrepreneurial community is a dramatic improvement in access to testing, just exploding right now, from for-profit companies developing both PCR testing and antibody testing. So the testing front's going to get better. The therapeutic front may improve very dramatically. We may not have to wait a year or a year and 3 months more to get a vaccine. We might start to see therapeutic interventions. It may not be hydroxychloroquine. It may not be azithromycin. There are a lot of things that people talk about, but there's something that's going to come through once we start having larger data sets and seeing how people respond. And we do have lots of laboratories of experimentation going on, as well as well over 100 clinical trials in the United States alone. So my feeling is that we've got 3 things going on. One is testing so that we can find cases, quarantine, isolate, protect others. 2 is to maintain social distancing as much as possible until we can get some handle on the epidemic. And then 3 is to be hopeful as well as investing in our therapeutic intervention development so that when the time is right, that we can actually do something to completely contain this. And I think that's where the hope is.
I want to turn to Jörg because a number of you have made references to the importance of having the right government policy right now. And we have a sense of what some of those things might be in terms of supporting small businesses, keeping people employed. Of course, there's a whole question around financial regulation, Andrew, that perhaps we can come back to in a moment in terms of policy tools. But Jörg, you're not just a scholar, but also an advisor to government. The German government has won some praise for aspects of its response. Can you give us a sense of the measures that are being taken there and the thought process behind it? And as you do that, I want to ask Ben to release the results from our second poll, where you can see that about a quarter of our listeners, our participants here, believe that the economic impact in their part of the world is catastrophic. 2/3 say it's severe, and only 6% say it's modest. So that's about as clear a picture as you get. Jörg, what's happening on the policy side?
So one important aspect we just rightly heard of is this testing. Unfortunately, and this is not better here in Germany than it is in other countries, we obviously don't report the negative tests. We don't do random sampling in particular. I think things that would really help to better understand what this is. So in that sense, it's not enough to simply talk about cases simply because we don't know out of which sample these cases are, or which sample they are derived from. So in that sense, an immediate policy response also here would be to have negative cases reported and also to start random sampling. This is just a general follow-up on the discussion before. Now, on the economic policy, it's very obvious that Germany will break with the tradition it has been known for. Some could also say has been criticized for. You have seen over recent years this so-called schwarze Null or black zero, which basically means that the German government tried to not create any new government debt for the last 5-6 years, which brought down the overall debt to GDP ratio to below 60%. But now recent measures would indicate that this government debt level could rise very rapidly, even to levels of 80 or 90% of GDP, meaning Germany is ready to spend up to $1 trillion or so in terms of government funds. Now the question is what really to do with this money. And the key issue at this point of time is, and Andrew pointed this out, in my view, absolutely correctly, is liquidity. So it is about providing liquidity to corporates in the first place. This is really the most important topic we need to deal with at this point of time. Germany has a government-owned bank, the so-called KfW, and they've increased enormously, the government has increased enormously the guarantees given to the KfW so that the KfW can pass out loans to small and medium-sized enterprises. Beyond that, and this is just a measure that was taken yesterday, and again, this speaks to what Andrew mentioned before, there's also now a significant fund available for renationalizations of certain companies. So in the first place, it could apply to, say, airlines, but I wouldn't rule out that this could also be used in the same way as maybe 2008, 2009, to capitalize by government funds the banking system for equity injections into the system. So in that sense, I think in particular, also in this context about is how can we coordinate these as we really think that vaccination is one, and we then make sure that all our research and development efforts and also later on the implementation efforts are coordinated in these ideas, but rather a globally concerted and really aligned response.
So Germany is going to start to renationalize if necessary. You mentioned global coordination. Let's start with the European piece. Jerome, I'd like to invite, I think we need across Europe to...
Sure, but before that, I just want to jump back a bit to what Howard said and coming back to the epidemic itself.
Of course.
So, country in isolation. I think the great problem of this West, and by the time China is out of this epidemic, now the epidemic is, China's economy was blocked before by containment, but now is also hampered by the lack of trade with European blocs. And in a little while, it would be the US would be in a major crisis, and then it would unfold probably in the Southern Hemisphere as well. So this crisis is not just an epidemic that happens in one country and that the containment actually is hampering the economy. It's just that it's so staggered and there's no coordination in terms of policies. Even if you take across Europe, it's quite staggering that there was no better coordination of policies. the major countries started to go in different ways in the beginning. So thank God the UK now has converged more towards the European model, but they lost a lot of time. And so I think that's the danger of the crisis, is that it's just unfolding. And once you've solved the problem in one part of the world, it may just come back. And so you have to spend a lot of resources to try to eradicate and to keep the virus out of there until we get a vaccine, but that's not nowhere near, I think. So in terms of policies, sure. So I think the European government, Italy, France, Germany was mentioned as well, have understood that this is a grave crisis. And so they roll out a lot of budget lines and help for service people and small enterprise and so on to help them survive the crisis.
Xiong, to get back to you, as you know, in this sort of interdependent world, you know, China has now moved from initially being the recipient of a lot of support to actually, you know, sending masks and personal protective equipment to Italy, to Spain, to other places. What role do you see for China going forward? And at the same time, perhaps picking up on the last point that Jerome mentioned, how is government policy going to try to prevent a further flare-up? Because until we have a vaccine, I understand how, you correct me if I'm wrong, there is a possibility, of course, of at least localized outbreaks again. Give us a sense of what this looks like.
Yes, I think now China coming back during the outbreak, we already built up like a huge capacity for masks, for medical device and the equipment. So if you need, I think you can place order now.
We lost
and the China
the audio there briefly.
Can supply. The more you order, the more China can supply. Really, this is a pandemic. It's local at the beginning, but now it's become global. So the global pandemic needs the global approach and the solution. So information and the resources sharing, coordination and the cooperation, helping and supporting each other are extremely, extremely important during this period. So no country can win the war alone. Not the United States, not China. We really need to cooperate together. Like China already built up the huge capacity. If you need, place the order. Now like 19% of Chinese factory already go back to work. But unfortunately, there is no order. So there's no order literally. So if you need, please place your order and China can provide as many as you want. Yeah, that's
such an important point. The fact that the pandemic moves as how you described, sort of, you know, east to west and hits different countries and different parts of the different of the world at different times. From a global economic point of view, there's a little bit of a silver lining in that, you know, as the Western Hemisphere now sees, you know, economic activity throttled back dramatically, the economies of China, South Korea, Japan, and so on are somewhat, you know, regaining strength potentially, and the supply chain changes that were made to ramp up the production of this equipment in those markets can perhaps come to the aid of others. I did want to release the result of the poll on global financial stability, and just to share it with you, after Andrew's perhaps recognition that this liquidity crisis could become a solvency crisis, 52% of our respondents, 414 folks are very concerned, 41%, 323 people are somewhat concerned, and again, only 7% are not really concerned or not at all concerned. We should talk a little bit about the politics of this, because all of you have eloquently spoken about the need to cooperate. There's cooperation among scientists and doctors, there's cooperation among businesses across their supply chains. Governments need to coordinate policy, not just within Europe, but globally. stimulating economic activity, and of course, at the same time, guaranteeing the stability of the financial system. And yet, I think it's fair to say that not only have we not seen as much cooperation as we should hope for, certainly among governments, but we're seeing finger pointing. And so I'd like any of you to jump in and perhaps share your perspective on why we've seen the finger pointing, the mudslinging perhaps, rather than concerted efforts to tackle what is clearly a global problem jointly. Anybody, please. Go ahead, Ignacio.
Thank you, David. I mean, definitely we are not ready to fight a global war. Countries are not prepared to work alongside. Institutions are not executive, but most of the time consulting, like the World Health Organization or the IMF. So we are not ready. And what we've seen is that each country is trying to fight independently this situation. I would like to come back to priorities. And we mentioned that priority today is definitely ensuring what I could say frontline health related spending. But we're starting to move, and as we see that China is about to be recovery, we need to start moving, and this might be a very good opportunity to coordinate efforts. I couldn't say country to country, but definitely in different geographic zones, and European communities are a great example on that, and Latin American community. We need targeted fiscal, monetary, and financial market measures. We need banks to start, central banks to start coordinating efforts. We need governments to start working together, developing not only health-related, but economic measures. We're gonna go through this. I was saying that this is a war, we are all soldiers, we're gonna win this war. The problem is at what cost, and what's going to happen when this situation from the health perspective clears up. And if we don't see this cooperation that you were requiring and cohesive measures, the whole can be much deeper than the crisis itself. So this is where coordination starts to be required today. And again, we have a great opportunity to behave in a different way, to behaving as countries, as human race in the past.
Yeah. Howie, this question, we talked about briefly before we started the session about how do we, I don't want to even repeat this sentence, sort of, you know, the cure can't be worse than the disease, or the solutions can't be more harmful than the problem, because I think many of us believe it's quite the opposite. But how do you, as somebody who has the healthcare and health knowledge on the one hand side, and you know, very much trained as an economist on the other hand, how do you think about right sizing a response and thinking about the economic costs of a public health response? And I just want to sort of lay this out there, right? It seems that we have decided sort of collectively, or at least the experts are telling us, the best thing for the economy is to prevent, or to end the pandemic, or to diminish it as quickly as possible. That, in the absence of testing and therapeutic interventions, requires social distancing. Social distancing kills your economic activity. And so we kind of have to kill the economy to then revive it afterwards, if you forgive the metaphor. How do you think about this? Do we have this sequence right? Is there no other way?
So I would just say, first of all, there's one immediate threat to everybody, and that is overwhelming the healthcare system, as we're witnessing right now in Italy, as is almost certainly starting to happen in Spain, and what is happening really in New York, and we're starting to move to country. So you have to be able to not, if you overwhelm the healthcare system, then people are going to die of heart attacks, strokes, surgeries that should be routine. They're going to die from trauma and so on. And so the first thing we have to do is mitigate the massive wave that is occurring throughout the country, whether we're measuring it or not at this moment. So that's number one. Once you get that under containment, then I think everything else, and I wish that Andrew, I think we lost Andrew, was still here, but I think everything else starts to look like things like quantitative easing and the way the Federal Reserve operates. I think it's very hard to know exactly when you start to ease up on the pedal, when you stop printing money, when you stop having zero interest rates. It's the same thing, I think, in healthcare. You're going to have to recognize that the things you do today are going to have significant influences over the next weeks and months beyond that, but they may very well be necessary then. It may be important to get the economy starting up a little bit and take the pressure off the brake just enough to see, how do our hospitals manage? How do we deal with the epidemic? Are we able to, manage the severe cases and so on? Because I think that's the trade-off you have to make. And that's why I'm so fired up right now about sort of the actions in our own country, in the United States right now, where people think that now's the time to take the foot off the brake, because I think that would be just deadly for not just people, but in the long run, the economy as well.
Yes, may I jump in?
Absolutely,
Yes.
please.
I think each government should try hard to maintain the domestic as well as the international supply chain, especially for the medicine, for the masks, for the test kits, okay? Those airlines, they cannot carry passenger now, but they can carry cargoes from China to US, from China to everywhere. They can carry those cargoes, okay? You stop people traveling, but don't stop cargoes. And also the tariff should be dropped immediately to zero. That's absolutely absurd. There's still a trade war going on between China and the US. No, there's no time for that. We should engage together to fight this pandemic together. I think China, US should stop immediately the trade war, should stop immediately blame each other. They should work together to fly the cargoes to the place people need. This is really about life and death. Don't play the politics here. Yeah, that's what I want to say.
I think there's a saying in English, you're preaching to the converted. I think all of us share that view and have been dismayed that not only has the trade war not ended and medical equipment been exempted from any tariffs, but rather that the rhetoric is in fact heating up as the US enters a presidential election in the fall. I think we do have some data comparing this to the global financial crisis. And I mean, this is stunning. I think if we had asked people 3 or 4 weeks ago, we wouldn't have gotten a result like this, where 2/3 of people now believe that the economic impact will be greater than the financial crisis. But Jörg, and perhaps I want to invite you to jump back in. If we take Andrew's point from before and say, if these measures that Howie and others have sketched out work, and this ends up being relatively short, and this being sort of the complete shutdown, really, because the pandemic is going to be with us for some time, then ideally we don't have sort of major structural problems in the economy. We just have this sort of deceleration, and then we need to just accelerate again. And so the recovery could be fairly quick. I'm wondering, I know it's dangerous to get economists to make predictions about the shape of recoveries, but what are your thoughts if policy to fight the pandemic work as hoped through social distancing, and if we're beginning to turn the corner in places like Italy and hopefully soon also Spain and the US, and economic policy, government policy is properly deployed, what does a best case scenario for the economy look like globally?
Yeah, it's absolutely right. The key question at this point of time is the uncertainty of how long the crisis will last, how intense it will be. We've seen just here in Germany, and I think it's the same for other countries, we've seen forecasts which range between -6% of GDP up to -20% of GDPs. So in any case, it will be worse than the financial crisis 11 or 12 years ago. And now it really depends a lot on the further reaction. And I couldn't agree more with what has been said before, that we need taking into account the overall importance of health, we need not to forget about the economy in the sense that we slowly need to test certain parts, that we need to release some of the activities again, start them again rather soon. And in particular, what we need to worry, I think, most about is the activities by these very small entrepreneurs, maybe even single employed entrepreneurs, who will suffer the most. And thus it's also, in my view, a very important part, rather than letting, say, helicopter money going down on everybody, but rather targeting exactly those small entrepreneurs, because they are so important, and they will be so important to keep alive at this point of time, because if they're gone once, it probably will rather be permanent unemployment, which we should be avoiding by all means. So therefore, and I mean, it's kind of obvious, but let me say it again: the shorter the crisis, the more likely it will be that the economy can recover soon and comprehensively.
Gemma, you spoke about the small businesses that Jörg just mentioned. You know, really micro enterprises. Politically, do they have a constituency in the Philippines? Will attention after sort of the immediate focus on combating the pandemic shift to small businesses in a place like the Philippines? And how can we make it so if it doesn't automatically?
You know, I think you hit the nail right on the head there. Unfortunately, the answer is no. In any economy, I can assume it's the airlines, it's the banks, it's these big manufacturing corporations that typically get the help of government. Of course, you say that these are the companies that employ a lot, but you're right. In the Philippines, 2/3, 63% of people are employed in micro, small, and medium enterprises, and unfortunately, that the survival of these small businesses probably will be determining whether this recovery is V-shaped, U-shaped, L-shaped, recession, or whatnot. And if I'm going to be paranoid about it, there is potential. We're not ruling out the fact that it might be a long, protracted recovery if you see a disappearance of these micro enterprises. And not just that, there could potentially be losses in terms of human capital. Thankfully, the death toll isn't as high as it could be yet so far in the Philippines. But you're seeing, I'm seeing a lot of my colleagues, for example, or work acquaintances with regard in the academe, or top business leaders. And for a country where your human capital is not exactly the most abundant, that's critical. We're suffering losses here more than we have in the last how many decades. And it could get worse. And it actually, if I could just add as well, with regards to how countries should be helping each other out. I hope in the medium term, we also start thinking about, aid is a bad word nowadays, but this might actually be a time where aid would be relevant again, especially for developing countries. We're talking about humanitarian crisis that could happen in lower middle income countries or upper middle income countries. Imagine if this hits your lower income countries, that would just, lead things awry.
I'm so glad that you mentioned this. And, we're seeing how difficult it is to achieve social distancing in a place like New York City or the Bay Area. Think about social distancing in the slums in Mumbai or the townships outside of Johannesburg or the favelas in Sao Paulo. And equally important, exactly, getting, the Chinas, the Americas, the Germanys, Italys, and Spain back on their feet economically is going to be to provide support for developing countries that will be hit as hard, if not harder, by all of this. Ben, if you can release, please, the results of this most recent poll. It turns out, 60% of our respondents or our participants believe this is going to be a long, slow recovery. So they're not convinced that if these public health measures work and government policy does what it's supposed to, that we'll just bounce back. We only have a couple of minutes left. A number of you have spoken about the global political dimension here. Let's try to perhaps paint a more hopeful picture. We can all focus on rhetoric and trade conflicts, but there's been a lot of scientific cooperation. There's a lot of business working across borders. Ignacio, you spoke about that before, businesses stepping up. What other pieces of evidence do you see that the global community is joining forces in dealing with this global pandemic? Are we beginning to shift from a sort of knee-jerk set of national responses to more cooperation? And more generally, I think we've had a number of questions in the chat. What does the future look like? I taught a course through the Global Network a couple of years ago called, the end of globalization ? And we concluded, it was too early to pronounce globalization dead. Is this going to reinvigorate global cooperation, or is this going to be a further boost for those who want to erect walls and disengage from the world? What are your thoughts on this? Who wants to go first?
There's no, isolation cannot win this war, definitely. If every country go along, like China, for example, China on its own, there might be second wave. We have to redo the whole thing again. So we really need coordination. We don't want to repeat the massive lockdown again, definitely not. So people kind of like compare it with the Second World War.
Yeah, if this is a war, we need to fight it together. And the enemy here is not another country. It's a string of RNA.
Yes.
We should all be able to come together around that. Ignacio.
I am not that optimistic. I think that we as people all over the world understand the importance of cooperation. The issue is we are in the hands of who we are. We look around the world, we are in the hand of populism and in the hands of governments that are much more protecting their interests and their country interests than trying to bet on collaboration. So I don't think that this is going to change in the short term. And my hope is that we as citizens understand in the hands of who we are and can change this in the, let's say, medium term in the next election cycle in different countries. Definitely, there is no way out of this thing without collaboration, and we need to step out as a completely different world. Let's change our politicians. That is one thing we
can all agree on. Look, and it is important. The comparison is made to the Great Depression, to World War II. These global calamities often produced new institutions, new types of politics, and it doesn't have to be as bleak. Ignacio, you're a little bit skeptical, but Ben, I think if you release the results, we'll see that a majority of the participants do actually think that this current crisis could lead to a renewed commitment to global governance and cooperation in the face of global challenges. So that's very positive. As we conclude, I'd love to just have each of you, perhaps from your domains, where you sit, your scholarly interests, identify, one indicator that you're going to look at over the next several weeks to gauge the trajectory, to gauge the economic impact of this crisis, and more generally, the impact of this crisis. Jerome, can we start with you? What are you looking at?
So sure. So actually, I've been looking at it's on my webpage as well on the mortality in different countries in Europe, in US, etc. And so I'm really tracking that every day to see how that dynamic unfolds. So I'm not as pessimistic as the majority of people here. I think there's a possibility that it rebounds quite quickly, at least from my experience of previous epidemics and instances like this. But we'll see.
Who goes next? So you're looking at
me, I will look at the traffic in Shanghai. The traffic, Shanghai is a city with population more than 20 million. The traffic is bad, it's really bad. But during the lockdown, there's no car on the road. It's like so scary. Now the traffic is sort of coming back. If it's getting really bad, which means it's recovered totally, but not yet there. Yes. For China, yeah.
So you're looking at the traffic in Shanghai. I see that my colleague Arturo Brice from IMD has joined, and I realized that I may have messed up in terms of conveying time. Arturo, we're actually close to wrapping up this session, and we're going around to give a sense of what indicators people are going to look at to gauge the economic impact of that. So I'm asking you to consider that question. And so you'll get the closing comments of this panel on where we stand in terms of economic recovery. So I'll give you a minute to just think about this. You'll conclude a session that you joined on the tail end of, but knowing you, I'm sure you'll do a terrific job with that.
Thank you.
So you're looking at traffic in Shanghai, Xiang. Ignacio, what are you looking at?
Excuse me, I didn't get the question.
Yeah, what indicator or set of indicators are you looking at to gauge this over the next couple of weeks?
I mean, definitely today in Mexico, we are still looking at the infection rate. And this is the focus of, you could say, government and population. From here, we will start looking at the peso. The peso is really going down. And we will start looking at the US economy indicators. What we learned from previous crises is that we will double down the GDP, in this case, decrease from what happens in the US. So we're going to be with a close eye on what's going on in the US economy and in Canada itself.
Great. So focus on the US. Gemma, what about you?
Yeah, it's pretty much the same. I would have said I'm not going to look at any economic indicator. I'm just going to be looking at the news and the rise in the cases because, our leaders focus on that, our citizens focus on that. And as long as the confidence of both the leaders and your citizens don't really, go up, you can't speak of any economic recovery whatsoever. So unfortunately, in this case, it's, economics is right there.
Secondary.
And everything else that's more important is lives. So.
Jörg, how about you?
Yeah, unfortunately, I couldn't agree more. I think the most important indicator, as sad as it is the number of deaths over the next couple of days, and in particular the deep hope, the sincere hope that it will go down, thus allowing also economic activity to follow again.
Howie.
Yes, to me, as I just keep looking at Italy and more at Spain. And I want to see Italy turn the corner. And once that happens, it'll give me faith that the United States, at least in their most focal outbreaks, will turn the corner. And that gives us a lot of hope. So I'm purely looking at countries that are a couple of weeks ahead of us and hoping. So
Arturo, I know this is unfair. You joined the session just a couple of minutes ago, and that was my mistake. But you're professor of finance at IMD. You lead the Competitiveness Institute. You've recently advocated for very strong government intervention there. Give us your summary of where we're at and where we're headed.
Hello, and I'm sorry for joining you so late, but I'm sure it has been extremely interesting. Obviously, I'm in a very particular part of the world. In Switzerland, the country's finances are very strong. So it's a country that could support the economy extremely well. At the same time, I'm Spanish, and as some of you said, now I'm following the news of my country on a constant basis because I think it is a good case study. And I think many other countries are going to follow in terms of the numbers. When I wake up in the morning, obviously I check markets. I think markets are telling us a lot. And I see that when you look at stock markets in the US, they are already pricing something that we expect is going to happen. And hopefully they have already priced everything. And as Jörg said as well, I am extremely focused on number of casualties, much more than on cases or anything like that. I think the number of casualties are telling us the true story about this pandemic. And the evolution and the comparison across countries is going to be extremely important in the coming days. Having said that, to me, it's very important as well, the fiscal policies that countries and governments are going to implement. I think we need to see now very important investment packages and spending packages by governments, Switzerland being one example. But I think it's going to happen, and it's happening in the United States, it's going to happen in Europe, it's going to happen everywhere else. And we're going to have a completely new set of policies relative to what we saw in 2008. So that's also a very important, I think, event that we need to look at, the government interventions.
I'm so grateful to all of you for taking the time, some of you early in the morning, others late at night. modeling really what we need at this point, which is dialogue across borders, interdisciplinary perspectives, a focus on what is most important, which is human life, and realizing that it is the public health emergency that has triggered this economic crisis, and any economic response has to be conscious that at the end it's about the people and their lives and how to best help and support. Certainly in the Global Network, we're going to try to keep this dialogue going. We'll have future events on this topic. This is precisely the kind of challenge that the Global Network was designed for. I've learned a great deal from each and every one of you, and I just want to say thank you on behalf of everybody who participated. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David.
Thank you all.